and good morning to everybody. What I'm going to do is add a local perspective to what Leanne and Martin have just been through there. If we go next slide, please. So I'm just going to go briefly about just some very brief context on Warrington pre-COVID. I've got some, some very similar graphs to show in terms of what's happened during the last 12 months during the COVID crisis. And then, how we're planning in terms of the new shape of traffic, and perhaps how some of that planning's adjusted as a result of COVID. And then just a few short slides at the end, just summarising what we see as some of our very key challenges in the next year or two, and then looking further forward in the next sort of 1 to 5 years and 5 to 10 years. Next slide, please. So just very briefly on Warrington. Equidistant between Liverpool and Manchester, sat between them there, surrounded by motorways, M6, M56, M62, very well connected, West Coast Main Line and Liverpool to Manchester lines going through the borough. It was designated as a new town back in the 60s. Population was 70,000 then, it's now 210,000, so it's trebled in size since then, and probably a lot more to come. Probably with the local plan up to probably 252, 60,000 in another 10 or 15 years time. So it's growing very quickly, and obviously just to give you some brief sort of geographical context. Next slide, please. As a result of that new town designation, our car ownership is very high. The dependencies are very high. We've got we've had historically high traffic flows. Daily congestion levels are high, combined with declining bus use and relatively low levels of walking and cycling. And obviously we're trying to turn that round, which obviously is very challenging. And I've got some slides on that a bit later on. Next slide, please. Just to briefly illustrate how car dependent we are, this is a graph we always use. This is census data. It's a bit old, but it's still very good data in terms of travel to work. The yellowy orange section in the middle is the percentage of travel to work by car, 74%. You compare that with the England average of 61. The comparison I always make is Milton Keynes, a pretty car dependent place. We're 5% higher than Milton Keynes in terms of car travel to work. So very, very car dependent. It's the way the new town was built, but obviously we're looking to address that in terms of encouraging other modes now. So yeah, next slide, please. In terms of congestion levels, so these are a couple of years out of date, this data, but basically it's showing certainly for a town of our size, our congestion is quite bad. We're not on the scale of Greater Manchester or Merseyside in terms of what happens in the big cities, but we're certainly well above the sort of the surrounding areas in terms of that level of congestion. There's a quite significant drop there between 2017 and 2018. That's as a result of the Mersey Gateway. You can see the effect that that had on Holton and ourselves. Obviously, very dramatic congestion, and we got some benefit from that as well too. In terms of, despite the toll being charged, people very heavily using the new Mersey Gateway Bridge. But so congestion is certainly an issue for us. Next slide, please. As I said before, the cocktail is a difficult one that we face in terms of bus patronage. This is ourselves and our three neighbours, Cheshire West, Cheshire East and Holton. The darkest line on there is the Warrington line. We have lost 50% of our bus passengers in the last 10 years. It's a pretty stark figure. And just in that, the line has just levelled off in 1819 and 1920. And before the COVID crisis, we were just starting to see some hope of growth back again in bus passengers, but obviously, I'll come to it later on. That is going to be a huge challenge for us in terms of restoring bus passenger numbers and achieving that mode shift. Next slide, please. More positive picture with rail. Trips. These are trips from all of the 7 stations in Warrington. They've more than doubled in the last 15 years. Obviously, very similar to national trends. But a more positive picture there, but again, equally challenging in terms of restoring people's confidence to come back to the rail network. So next slide, please. Cycling, we've had a very good increase in cycling, 35% increase. We've got a number of automatic counting sites, and we back this up with manual data collection as well. But despite that 35% increase in the last 15 years, we're still below the England average, and we're above the Northwest average, but we're below the England average. And Warrington is a relatively compact, relatively flat town, so we think there's a lot that we need to do with that, and we are making steps in that direction. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to come on to now, I've got about 5 slides here with some very similar patterns to what Leanne and Martin have just brought out in terms of what's happened in the last 12 months with the COVID crisis. We produce a much bigger scorecard with this, with about 12 slides on it that we've been producing every week through the crisis. But these next few slides will just give you a flavour as to what's been happening in the last 12 months. So next slide, please. This first one's traffic levels. This is a selection of about 6 automatic traffic counting sites on all the radial routes into the town centre. You can see there that this is the last 12 months data compared with the previous 12 months. It's slightly different to before. We did have the previous 12 months data, so we've done a direct 2019-2020 comparison. You can see obviously it dropped off a cliff at the left-hand side there with the first lockdown. We had traffic levels about 65% down in the week, about 75% down at weekends. Obviously that then built back up. You've got the non-essential retail restart that happened last summer, and then sort of August, September time, we got up to about 10% down in terms of traffic levels. Obviously Warrington then hovered between tier 2 and eventually into tier 3. The second lockdown knocked things down again. Strong recovery before Christmas. Again, we got back up to about 10% below previous levels. And then obviously the lockdown that we're in now got us to about 30% down. Probably not as dramatic as some of the areas. We were 65% down versus we're about 30% down now in the lockdown that we're in now. Next slide, please. Car park use. We've got a 1,200 space car park that supports a major regeneration in the town. So this is data from that car park in terms of, again, comparing it with the previous year. So we've got last March on the left-hand side there, very low figures, strong recovery. Through the summer, we actually opened a new market that was served by the car park there. So we got very briefly back above last year's levels, very briefly when the market opened last July. But then again, the second lockdown, a good Christmas recovery, but again, that peak is Christmas. But now we're down at 20% of usual figures, very low parking numbers, and it's been very consistent during the lockdown that we're in now. Next slide, please. Bus patronage, again, fell off a cliff. We were down as low as 4 or 5% at one point in the first lockdown. A recovery, but we only ever got to sort of 50%, 55% of previous year usage. A bit of a peak before Christmas in terms of Christmas shopping. But again, we're at some very low figures there, 29% at the moment. There's some very small signs of recovery. The schools being off has had a significant impact to that. We have a lot of school children that do travel to travel by public bus service. So a lot lower than it was before. Next slide, please. Just in terms of the wider economic impact, what we've also got is counters on all the main entrances into the main town centre. So this is footfall in Warrington town centre. So you can see there that the left-hand side is just before COVID, some very similar levels there. Drops off a cliff last March, and then very similar patterns to before. You can see the Christmas peak on the right-hand side, but obviously not recovered to anything at the same extent. And obviously the lockdown that we're in now has reduced those figures to just over a third there of the footfall that we've had for the last couple of months. Next slide, please. Cycling, very similar to the graph Leanne showed earlier. You can see that significant increase in cycling. We had between 3 and 4 times the number of cyclists at various points last summer. So a very seasonal peak there. That then settled down during the rest of the year, but we still have got cycling above what it was before. But obviously winter has knocked that back, and obviously we need to build on that going forward. So next slide, please. In terms of how we're planning for this, we had our fourth local transport plan adopted just over 12 months ago, and we set some very ambitious challenges in terms of mode shift. You know, we want to get our car mode share down from 74% to 60%. We need to treble bus use. We need to treble cycle use. Some very ambitious targets. Next slide, please. But there's hope there. This graph shows in terms of the method of travel to work by distance for Warrington residents. You can see that the left graph is particularly, the left pie chart is particularly stark. We've got about half, you know, trips of less than 2 kilometres. Half of them are going by car, you know, and then 2 to 5 kilometres, you know, about 2/3 going by car. You know, these are the trips that we need to target with on foot, by bicycle, and obviously the longer trips on the right-hand side that they're to target with public transport. You know, we've got a lot to go at in terms of short distance trips. Next slide, please. So again, with school, you know, again, we've got significant mode share and relatively short distances that people are travelling to school. So an awful lot for us to go at in terms of mode of travel to school. Next slide, please. This shows that occasional cycle use is good in Warrington, stacks up very well, but regular cycle use is not so good. So we've got people trying the bike again. What we need to get them to do is to cycle more regularly, and that's going to be the real challenge that we've got in Warrington. Next slide, please. So just in terms of, you know, the new shape, you know, how are we going to get ourselves out of this crisis in transport terms? And, you know, authorities all over the country, you know, we're thinking about this at the moment. You know, what are some of the most critical short-term challenges? You know, next 12 to 24 months. Working patterns are bound to change. There's going to be more working at home. The confidence of people to return to public transport, I know it's an issue the DfT are wrestling with, and we're all wrestling with. How do we build that confidence for people to return? Any reduction in passenger numbers is going to put services at risk if we're not helped out financially, or that financial help doesn't continue. Serious risk of mode shift to the car. You know, so how do we, you know, ensure that doesn't happen? You know, how can we get those mode shares of walking and cycling increased? Something I'm very passionate about is integrated, smart, and flexible ticketing. Yeah, the integrated and smart needs a lot doing to it. The flexible ticketing, you know, if people are having 3 days in the office, 2 days working at home, your season ticket model doesn't really work anymore. You know, so what's going to happen with flexible ticketing for regular users of public transport? Funding, lack of medium long-term funding settlements. You know, we watch jealously on to Liverpool and Manchester, who are going to get long-term transport funding settlements. That doesn't apply to us. You know, that's going to be a real challenge for us, and that revenue funding in the short term in terms of keeping our bus services going in particular. Next slide, please. You know, so how do we take that forward next few years? We've got lots of studies going on to encourage the first and last mile of people's journeys in and out of the town centre. How can we improve the experience there? You know, there's a ring road around the town centre. It's a significant barrier to walking, cycling, and public transport. Our LC WIP, we've got 3 corridors progressed to SOBC now. We need to get those further forward to OBC. Active Travel Fund. We've done a lot of stuff in the town centre. Some of it's gone down well, some of it's not gone down so well, and obviously we're needing to embed that in low traffic neighbourhoods. Bus priority and mass transit, smart ticketing, and obviously we're still trying to pursue a zero emission bus fleet, and we are building a new depot for our municipal bus operator at the moment. You know, Traffic Management Act Part 6, that would be good if that came along, you know, in terms of managing our network, and dare I say it would bring some income in as well. Other fiscal measures, we've got all our elections in May. I can't go into any more detail about that, but I'm sure you can guess what they might be. Town deal and levelling up fund, we've got a town deal, and obviously we've all got levelling up fund bids to submit now. And we've got a scheme called the Western Link, which is a £200 million scheme, which will provide a bypass to the west of the town, And how do we capitalise on that in terms of road space reallocation? Next slide, please. So the Western Link with open to traffic, we're working now what complementary road space reallocation we can get in place to get that mode shift. Working very hard to secure an NPR station for Warrington as a hub station between NPR and HS2. In terms of the Liverpool to Manchester line, we're looking to secure a metro rail and mass transit network. Fiscal measures, what happens with national road pricing in the future. Next slide, please. And that's it from me.